Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bonita Alicia Bart. I am the founder of the Caribtecture Research Project. I hail from the beautiful island of St. Lucia. Caribtecture aims to research and publish Caribbean architectural history and design, to create both a visual and written narrative of Caribbean architectural history, and we hope to do so by collaborating with writers, historians, and architects and other designers throughout the region. So today I'm going to be presenting my research project titled The Architectural Language in Affordable Social and Urban Housing. So we will be looking at the interrelations among local architectural terms. This paper argues that the region's imprecise and interchangeable use of these terms carry measurable policy and funding consequences. So the objectives of this presentation is as follows. So we will first focus on defining social, affordable, and urban housing and how they have become an important part of our daily conversations. In this context, a careful analysis of definitions, policies, and design approaches is essential to illuminate the connections among these terms and to clarify their collective significance. So we're looking at affordable housing now, and the term affordability is contextually unstable, so it shifts across economic, demographic, and geographic context. So what's affordable in Hong Kong is obviously not what is necessarily affordable in the Caribbean region. So this is why we need a local definition, and that is essential. Affordable housing is defined by its mechanism of delivery, not merely its conditions of provision. So there's two points that we're going to look at that defines the terminology of affordable housing. So affordability is best achieved through phased construction and user participation rather than fully furnished units. And affordable housing offers not just a lower price point, but a pathway towards ownership, independence, and growth. How can we use scarce public funds to create assets that gain value over time rather than depreciating? So doing this, you're structuring a sense of independence and dignity within the design. And in this case study, the project reframes affordable housing through an incremental model. So families receive a structurally completed half house, as you can see here, that can be expanded over time. The language of social housing. So architectural generosity to dignified comfort and humane living spaces is an essential component of successful social housing because it creates the conditions that enable stability, well-being, and eventual independence. So the success of social housing is not measured by the number of people that are housed, which is unfortunately the rubric we tend to use, but it should be measured by its ability to facilitate social and economic progression. Under social housing, we're going to be looking at two key points. So number one, social housing as a transitional mechanism towards independence. So it should not be understood as a permanent accommodation, but as a structured intervention that supports residents as they move towards greater autonomy and self-sufficiency. Two, social housing as a provider of dignity through architectural quality. The physical environment is not secondary to the social mission, and creating a safe architectural space allows for the reduction in crime, high stress environments, and a general sense of good community and well-being. The case study for social housing that we will be looking at is a former hospital, about 3.4 hectare site in central Paris. It was awaiting redevelopment into an eco neighborhood when a coalition of nonprofits stepped in to activate the vacant space rather than leave it idle. I chose this case study to highlight both arguments. So this design employs a retention strategy. So they're repurposing existing infrastructure and it doubles as a social transitional tool. It's equipped with different social and welfare programs to assist citizens back on their feet to full independence. The language of urban housing shifts the frame entirely. It is concerned not with the terms of provision, but with the conditions of settlement. What makes housing urban is not the building type, but the density, connectivity, movement, and social complexity within which it sits. And the two key points for this definition is one, urban housing is defined by settlement conditions rather than housing provision. So urban housing is characterized by density, connectivity, mobility, and social interactions of the urban environment. So the design needs to cater to this. And two, Urban housing requires both spatial and social equity. So, simply distributing houses across geographical spaces does not guarantee equal access to opportunities. You need low income housing, middle income, and upper income mixed together to have a cohesive social space within the urban fabric. This case study was completed by BIG in Copenhagen back in 2018. And at residential scale, the project directly challenges the assumptions that affordability within an urban space must result in spatial austerity. So, through prefabricated modular construction and the use of modest materials, BIG achieved a 3.5-meter ceiling height, which is standard above standard level comfortability for urban housing, floor to ceiling windows, and a private outdoor terraces for all 66 units stacked on top of each other. So it's in terms of the spatial planning for the urban form, it works while also solving the problem. From definition to evidence. So we're moving to the second half of what the paper addresses. So what does the data show about how Caribbean housing is actually funded? We looked at World Bank's portfolio of projects within the region in comparison to other parts of the world, as well as Caribbean Development Bank and other localized funding agencies. So we've got three searches that we started with at the World Bank. The results are 500 for both social housing and affordable housing projects, 97 for affordable housing projects, with a combined total spending of $53.5 billion in combined commitments. So the housing projects are concentrated in a few regions, with Latin America and the Caribbean recording the highest numbers of social housing at 132, urban housing at 103, and affordable housing at a low at 22 projects in total. So affordable housing projects remain comparatively limited across all regions. We also have Western and Central Africa at 13, East Asia, Pacific, and Europe and Central Asia at 9, and South Asia, the lowest at 7. So this suggests that affordability is often addressed within broader housing programs rather than as a standalone intervention. Moving away from the joint assessment of Caribbean and Latin America, we're going to zoom in on the Caribbean now. We've got 29 social housing projects, a total of 1,474 million committed, urban housing with 30, 1,583 million committed, and affordable housing at 4 with 281 million committed. So that's 87% fewer projects. This Caribbean underrepresentation in affordable housing category is analytically important, as it suggests that when the World Bank funds housing in the Caribbean, it tends to classify and frame through social and urban lens rather than the affordable designation. We can define this as a terminological preference with real policy implications. So we're going to be looking at 3 points to further discuss this. So number one, the Caribbean is funded for recovery, not provision. So when we looked at the data, the dominant category across both social and urban housing for the Caribbean is disaster and reconstruction at 62% of the social housing project expenditure and 77% of the urban housing projects. So the terminology of social and urban housing in the Caribbean in practice is largely a disaster finance vocabulary. There was some other spending that was done for urban infrastructure, social protection, climate resilience, neighborhood upgrading, and other. From the bar chart, what we recognize is that majority of the World Bank's primary vehicle for Caribbean housing engagement is post-disaster relief and not planned provision. And that is an important fact given that we are currently faced with climate change, which will have significant impacts on our housing stock. Point number 2 looks at affordable housing is almost invisible in the Caribbean region. So earlier we mentioned that there are only 4 Caribbean projects that carry the affordable housing designation, totaling 281 million. So this intervention is the analytical core of this paper. The term that the Caribbean professionals tend to reach for most steadily at seminars and in policy documents is the term that generates the least institutional traction at the World Bank level. affordable housing is in many ways invisible, yet it is the term that is used the most by comparison. However, when we look at the World Bank Caribbean funding by the term, it's almost sort of the reverse. So urban is trailing with 1.5 billion, followed by social closely, and then affordable being the lowest. This is somewhat of an inversion. So whether we decide to move forward and start to define and redefine these terminologies and what the policies that will be implemented, as well as the architectural design language of each of these terminologies, so that we can have standard expectations as we approach these funding agencies for help. Point number 3, the terminology gap has a geography. It concentrates risk in the most vulnerable countries. Haiti, St. Martin, and the Dominican Republic dominate the Caribbean projects list, not because they have the most sophisticated housing programs, but because they have suffered the most catastrophic disasters. Meanwhile, smaller OACS states such as St. Lucia, Grenada, Dominica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines appear primarily through resilience and vulnerable reduction projects rather than through housing delivery programs. Terminological imprecision does not affect everyone equally. It is the smaller, less disaster prone states that lose the most when housing language fails to connect with funding, architecture, and also defining the architectural design and policy strategies. I want us to move now to localize funding agencies within the region. So let's take a look at CDB. Based on their database, we know that CDB does not lend directly to families. It lends to national development banks, which lend to households, and the criteria applied at each layer determines who qualifies. So the terminology that you use to access that pipeline is not incidental. It is a mechanism by which you either enter the queue or you miss it entirely. Funding architecture is built around intermediaries, and that gap is where the terminologies matters most. When we look at this chart, we can see that every layer of this chain applies its own eligibility criteria. And every criterion is defined using the language of affordable social and urban housing that is unique to them. So as a result, a proposal that uses the wrong term at the wrong tier or at the wrong financial institution does not simply receive less money, they may receive none. The other point is the region has its own institutional infrastructure, but it is built on a language it did not write. So if we were to go back throughout history and sort of see where the Caribbean adopted these different terminologies. So the term affordable, the Caribbean's adoption of the term affordable housing did not emerge from within the region's own policy tradition. It was imported through the institutional frameworks of international development finance and the post-independent state building projects of the 1960s and 1970s. So it's a remnant of colonization. And for social, the adoption in linguistic terms, a late and somewhat imprecise borrowing for most of the region's post-independence history, what would else where be classified as social housing operated under the label of public housing, low-cost housing, or simply government housing. And I think we all know the stigma that unfortunately comes along with the term. When we look at urban, for much of the 20th century, Caribbean governments distinguished between rural and urban housing, primarily as a geographic qualifier for project targeting, rather than as a conceptual framework of thinking differently about the design, the density, and the infrastructure. So the term urban housing was, in effect, a classification without a theory. And as Caribbean cities begin to develop and our populations begin to grow and become more quote unquote urban, there has to be some serious thought as to how we define our urban spaces, our urban fabrics, and of course, the policies that we're going to use to ensure we have social equity and financial equity within our urban housing projects. So, in conclusion, the problem is not only that we borrow foreign funding frameworks, but we are also borrowing a language in which those frameworks are written without interrogating the conditions those words presuppose. And I think that also would sort of bleed into what we fund, how we go about writing these bids and these reports, and how we go about accessing the world's global financial pocket to help us as we build a stronger region. This is a summary slide. I can definitely have this shared with everyone. So, borrowed language, broken foundations, what the terminologies assume. And on this side, we have our summary zooming in on the Caribbean. So, the World Bank findings, as well as the regional bank findings. Thesis in summary. The paper argues that the Caribbean's interchangeable use of affordable social and urban housing is not merely a semantic inconvenience, it is a mechanism of structural exclusion. These three terms map onto distinct institutional categories within international development finance organizations. The failure to use them with precision means Caribbean practitioners and governments consistently write proposals, policies, and programs that fail and fall into the wrong funding categories or none at all. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation. If you have any questions, comments, or queries, please send an email to caribtecture@gmail.com. I would be happy to engage. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Have a good day.